Rain hammered against the windows of the small roadside diner as Emily Carter wiped down table 7 for the third time that night. The neon sign outside flickered weakly in the storm, making the empty parking lot glow red and blue like a police siren. It was nearly midnight. Most people were home with their families. Emily was balancing overdue bills in her head while pretending everything was fine. Her rent was late. Her mother's medical treatment was getting more expensive, and the diner owner had already warned her that business was too slow to keep everyone employed much longer. Still, Emily smiled at every customer, because sometimes a smile was the only thing she still had left to give. The bell above the diner door suddenly rang. Cold wind rushed inside. A man stepped in slowly. Everyone in the diner looked at him for a second, then looked away. His coat was soaked from the rain. His beard was untrimmed. His boots were muddy and worn out. He looked homeless. One customer quietly moved her purse closer. Another whispered something under his breath and laughed. The cook in the kitchen frowned. "Great," he muttered. Another guy looking for free coffee. But Emily didn't laugh. She grabbed a clean towel and walked toward the man. "Good evening," she said softly. "You can sit anywhere you'd like." The man looked surprised, almost as if nobody had spoken kindly to him in a very long time. "Thank you," he replied quietly. His voice was calm, educated, not what Emily expected. He sat alone near the back window, where rainwater raced down the glass. Emily handed him a menu. "I'll give you a minute," she said. The man studied the menu carefully, then looked embarrassed. "What's the cheapest thing here?" he asked. Emily glanced toward the kitchen, then back at him. "The soup special is good tonight," she said, "and it comes with bread." He nodded slowly. "I'll take that." "And coffee?" Emily asked. The man hesitated. "How much extra?" Emily smiled gently. "It's on the house tonight." The man stared at her for a moment, not suspicious, just deeply surprised. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," Emily replied, "but I want to." For the first time that night, the man smiled. And somehow, despite the storm outside, the diner suddenly felt warmer. In the kitchen, the cook rolled his eyes. "You keep feeding people for free, and you'll be homeless too," he grumbled. Emily ignored him. She carried the soup carefully to the man's table. Steam rose into the cold air between them. "Careful," she said. "The bowl's hot." The man wrapped his hands around it like someone holding on to life itself. "You're very kind," he said quietly. Emily shrugged. "My mom always said people remember kindness longer than money." The man looked down at the soup. "Your mother sounds wise." "She is," Emily said. "She's sick, though." The words slipped out before she could stop them. She normally never shared personal problems with customers, but something about this man felt strangely comforting. "She raised me alone," Emily continued. "Now I'm trying to take care of her." The man listened carefully, not pretending to care, actually listening. "That's a heavy burden for someone your age," he said. Emily laughed softly. "Life doesn't exactly ask permission before becoming difficult." The man smiled again. "That may be the smartest thing I've heard in years." For the next hour, the diner stayed mostly empty. Emily refilled his coffee twice. The man ate slowly, gratefully savoring every bite. Outside, thunder cracked across the sky. Then suddenly, the lights went out. The diner fell into darkness. A few customers complained immediately. "Perfect." The cook shouted from the kitchen. Storm knocked the power again. Emergency lights flickered dimly. Rain battered the roof harder than before. Emily hurried to calm everyone down. But when she turned toward the back of the diner, she noticed a homeless man sitting perfectly calm in the darkness, almost thoughtful, as if the storm reminded him of something important. Then he asked a strange question. "Emily, do you believe one moment can change a person's entire life?" She paused. "I think it can," she answered. The man nodded slowly. "Good," he whispered, "because tonight might be that moment for you." Before Emily could respond, headlights flashed outside the diner windows. A black luxury car pulled into the parking lot. Then another, and another. 3 expensive vehicles stopped in front of the tiny roadside diner. Everyone inside turned toward the windows. The cook blinked in confusion. What in the world? Men in dark suits stepped out into the rain, holding umbrellas. One of them rushed toward the diner door and opened it quickly. The entire room fell silent. The suited man looked directly toward the homeless customer sitting in the back, his expression filled with relief. "Sir," he said urgently, "we've been searching everywhere for you." The entire diner froze. Emily looked from the suited men back to the homeless man, and suddenly her heartbeat quickened, because the man sitting in front of her was no ordinary homeless stranger. Not even close. The man sighed softly and stood up. Every movement suddenly carried quiet authority. The suited employees immediately straightened their posture. One handed him a dry coat. Another lowered his head respectfully. The cook nearly dropped a plate. Emily stared in complete disbelief. "Who are you?" she whispered. The man looked at her calmly. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out an old silver key. He placed it gently in Emily's hand. "This," he said quietly, "belongs to a place your father once dreamed of owning." Emily's face went pale. "My father?" The man nodded slowly. "Yes." Emily's breath caught in her throat, because her father had died 15 years ago, and nobody in this town ever talked about him anymore. Nobody except her mother. The diner suddenly felt impossibly quiet. Rain hammered outside. Thunder shook the windows. But Emily could hear only one thing, her own heartbeat. The stranger closed her fingers around the silver key. "Tomorrow morning," he said softly, "go to 214 Willow Street." Emily frowned. "That building's abandoned." "Not anymore," the man replied. Then he looked directly into her eyes. "And when you open the door, your life will never be the same again." Emily barely slept that night. The silver key sat on her kitchen table beside a stack of unpaid bills and her mother's medicine bottles. Every few minutes, she glanced at it again, wondering if the entire thing had been some elaborate joke. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The man's eyes had been too sincere, too calm, too certain. At 6 a.m, Emily stood by the window of her tiny apartment, watching rainwater drip from the rooftops outside. Her mother, Helen, slowly walked into the kitchen wrapped in a blanket. "You're awake early," Helen said softly. Emily hesitated. Then she placed the silver key on the table. "Mom, did Dad ever talk about a place on Willow Street?" Helen froze instantly. The color drained from her face. "Why are you asking that?" Emily noticed her mother's hands trembling slightly. "A man came into the diner last night," she explained. "He looked homeless, but then these businessmen showed up for him. Before he left, he gave me this key." Helen stared at the key like she had seen a ghost. Then tears slowly filled her eyes. "Oh, my God," she whispered. Emily's chest tightened. "You know what this is?" Helen carefully sat down. "For years, your father dreamed of opening a community restaurant," she said quietly. "Not just a business, a place where nobody would be turned away hungry." Emily listened silently. "He found an old building on Willow Street," Helen continued. "He wanted to renovate it himself. He believed the town needed a place where rich and poor could sit side by side." Emily swallowed hard. "But he died before it happened." Helen nodded sadly. "After the accident, the building was sold. Everything disappeared." Emily slowly looked down at the key again. "But how did that man know about Dad?" Helen whispered something that made Emily's stomach twist. "Because your father once saved his life." Silence filled the room. "What?" Emily asked. Helen leaned back in her chair, remembering. "Years ago, before you were born, a terrible snowstorm stranded several people outside town. Your father found a man unconscious in his car near Miller's Bridge." Emily listened carefully. "He brought him home, fed him, let him stay with us for days." Helen smiled faintly through tears. "We had almost nothing back then, but your father always said kindness mattered most when it cost something." Emily's eyes widened slowly. "The man from the diner?" Helen nodded. "I think that was him." 2 hours later, Emily stood outside 214 Willow Street. The old brick building looked forgotten by time. Dust covered the windows. Paint peeled from the walls. Rust clung to the metal sign hanging above the entrance. But something felt strange. The front door looked brand new, and beside it sat a small black envelope with her name written neatly across the front. Emily looked around nervously before opening it. Inside was a short handwritten note. Some debts cannot be repaid with money. Beneath the message was a second line. Open the door, Emily. Her hand shook slightly as she slid the silver key into the lock. Click. The door slowly opened inward. Emily stepped inside and stopped breathing for a moment. The building wasn't abandoned at all. The inside had been completely restored. Warm lights glowed softly above polished wooden floors. Fresh flowers sat on the tables. A massive modern kitchen sparkled behind a glass window. And hanging on the far wall was a framed photograph of her father. Emily covered her mouth instantly. Tears filled her eyes. In the picture, her father stood smiling beside the same mysterious man from the diner, except younger, cleaner, and wearing an expensive suit. Below the photograph was a plaque. To the man who helped me when nobody else would. Emily slowly walked closer. Her legs felt weak. Then she noticed another envelope resting beneath the frame. Inside was a legal document. She scanned the page once, then again in disbelief. The property ownership had been transferred into her name, completely paid for. Emily nearly dropped the papers. "This can't be real," she whispered. "You deserve to know the full story." Emily turned quickly. The mysterious man stood quietly near the doorway behind her. But today, he looked entirely different. Clean suit, shined shoes, perfect posture. Yet somehow, his eyes remained exactly the same. Calm, gentle, tired. Emily stared at him in shock. "Who are you?" she asked again. This time he answered, "My name is Jonathan Reed." Emily's eyes widened instantly. Even she recognized the name. Jonathan Reed was one of the wealthiest businessmen in the country, owner of hotels, restaurants, real estate companies. People called him ruthless, brilliant, untouchable, and yet, last night, he had sat alone in a storm eating soup in a roadside diner. Jonathan slowly walked beside the photograph of Emily's father. 30 years ago, he said quietly, I was arrogant, obsessed with money, success, power. His voice carried deep regret. One night, during a snowstorm, my car slid off the road. I would have died there if your father hadn't found me. Emily listened without moving. I offered him money afterward, Jonathan continued. A lot of money. He smiled sadly, but he refused. What did he say? Emily asked softly. Jonathan looked directly at her. He said, if you really want to repay me someday, help someone when it's inconvenient. Emily felt tears returning again. For years, Jonathan said, I forgot those words. I built companies, made billions, but somewhere along the way, I became the kind of man your father would have pitied. Silence filled the building. Last month, Jonathan continued quietly, my doctors told me I have a serious heart condition. Emily's expression changed instantly. I'm sorry. Jonathan nodded faintly. When people believe time is endless, they postpone becoming better. He looked around the beautiful restaurant. But your father's kindness stayed with me all these years. Emily stared at the room in disbelief. You built this? Jonathan smiled slightly. No. He handed her another folded document. Your father designed it. Emily unfolded the papers carefully. Her breath caught instantly. They were old architectural sketches, hand-drawn restaurant layouts, kitchen plans, community dining tables. At the top corner of every page, her father's handwriting appeared clearly. Carter's Place, everyone eats. Emily began crying openly now. Jonathan gave her time. No one ever believed in people the way your father did, he said softly. Not because they earned it, but because they needed it. Emily wiped her tears slowly. Why give this to me? Jonathan smiled gently. Because last night, you did exactly what your father once did for me. Emily looked confused. I only gave you soup and coffee. No, Jonathan replied quietly. You gave dignity. The words hit harder than Emily expected. Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out a final envelope. This contains enough funding to keep the restaurant operating for 2 years. Emily stared at him speechlessly. But there's one condition. What condition? Jonathan smiled for the first time that morning. The first person served here each night must be someone who cannot afford the meal. Emily's eyes filled again. Then suddenly, the front door burst open. A nervous man in a gray suit hurried inside. "Mr. Reed," he shouted urgently. Jonathan turned calmly. "What is it?" The employee looked pale. "There's been a problem with the board meeting in Chicago." Jonathan frowned slightly. The employee hesitated before speaking again. "Someone leaked confidential information to the press." Jonathan's expression darkened, and the man swallowed hard. "They're saying your own son is responsible." The entire room fell silent. Emily looked toward Jonathan in shock, but Jonathan didn't speak. He simply closed his eyes for one long moment, as though the betrayal hurt far deeper than anyone could see. Then slowly, he looked back at Emily and whispered something that changed everything again. "My son believes money is the only thing that matters." Jonathan's voice became quieter. "But I think meeting you is about to prove him wrong." The restaurant officially opened 3 weeks later. A brand new sign hung above the entrance. "Carter's Place. Everyone eats." People from all over town came to see it. Some arrived because they were curious, some because they heard a billionaire funded it, and some because they simply needed a warm meal. Emily welcomed every single person with the same smile. Rich families sat beside exhausted construction workers. College students shared tables with elderly widows. Nobody was treated differently, exactly the way her father once imagined. And every night, the first meal served was always free. No questions asked. Jonathan Reed visited often, sometimes in expensive suits, sometimes wearing the same old coat from the diner. Emily eventually realized why. The coat reminded him who he used to be and who he still wanted to become. One evening, the restaurant buzzed with laughter and conversation when a black sports car stopped outside. Several people glanced through the windows. A tall man stepped out wearing a designer coat and sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. Confident, sharp, arrogant, Jonathan's son had arrived. Daniel Reed. Even before he entered, tension filled the room. Jonathan looked up slowly from his coffee. Daniel walked inside without smiling. His eyes scanned the restaurant critically. "This is the place?" he asked coldly. Emily noticed Jonathan's face tighten slightly. "Yes," Jonathan answered calmly. Daniel scoffed. "You spent millions on a charity restaurant." "It's more than that," Jonathan replied. Daniel ignored him and turned toward Emily. "You're the waitress?" Emily crossed her arms slightly. "I own the restaurant." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Interesting investment strategy." Jonathan stood slowly. "That's enough." But Daniel wasn't finished. "The board thinks you're losing focus," he said sharply. "Ever since your diagnosis, you've been making emotional decisions." Several customers quietly stopped eating. Nobody spoke. Jonathan remained calm. "You leaked company documents," he said quietly. Daniel shrugged. "Business is war." "And family?" Jonathan asked. Daniel hesitated briefly. Then his expression hardened again. "Family doesn't matter if the company collapses." Emily saw pain flash across Jonathan's eyes. Real pain, not anger, not embarrassment, disappointment, deep disappointment. Jonathan slowly looked around the restaurant. "At your age," he said softly, "I believe exactly the same thing." Daniel laughed bitterly. "And now what? You suddenly became a saint because a waitress gave you soup?" The room became completely silent. Jonathan stared at his son for several seconds before answering. "No." His voice remained calm. "I became ashamed." Daniel's confident expression weakened slightly. Jonathan walked toward the center of the restaurant. "When I was younger, I measured human value by success," he continued. "Money impressed me. Power impressed me." Then he pointed gently toward the customers eating nearby. "But none of those things matter when your life falls apart." Daniel looked uncomfortable now. Jonathan's voice softened further. "The people who save you are rarely the powerful ones." He looked directly at Emily. "Sometimes they're just ordinary people who choose kindness when it would be easier not to." Emily felt tears sting her eyes again. Daniel rolled his jaw impatiently. This is emotional nonsense. Then suddenly, an elderly man near the back of the restaurant stood up slowly. I disagree. Everyone turned toward him. The old man wore simple work clothes and held a cane in trembling hands. I lost my house last winter, he said quietly. I came here hungry 3 weeks ago. He looked toward Emily warmly. She fed me before I even asked for help. Another voice spoke up. Then another. A single mother near the window smiled softly. This place gave me meals when I couldn't afford groceries. A delivery driver nodded. They let my son celebrate his birthday here for free. An elderly woman wiped tears from her eyes. This restaurant made me feel human again after my husband died. Daniel looked around slowly. The entire room had become filled with stories. Not about money, not about status, about dignity, about kindness, about hope. For the first time since entering the restaurant, Daniel looked uncertain. Jonathan stepped closer to his son. You think power comes from controlling people, he said quietly. But real power comes from lifting them when they fall. Daniel looked away. You built an empire, he muttered. Jonathan nodded sadly. Yes. Then he placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. But your grandfather would have been prouder of this restaurant. Daniel froze, because Jonathan almost never spoke about family. The room stayed silent. Then, unexpectedly, Emily walked toward the kitchen. A minute later, she returned carrying a bowl of hot soup, the same soup she had served Jonathan that stormy night. She placed it gently in front of Daniel. He looked confused. What's this? Emily smiled softly. The cheapest thing on the menu. Several customers quietly laughed. Even Jonathan smiled. Daniel stared down at the bowl for a long moment, then finally asked something nobody expected. Why are you being nice to me? Emily answered instantly. Because someone has to start somewhere. The words hit him harder than anyone anticipated. Daniel looked around the restaurant again, at the people smiling, talking, eating together. For the first time in years, nobody in the room cared who he was. And strangely, that felt freeing. He slowly picked up the spoon, tasted the soup, then lowered his head quietly. It's good, he admitted. Jonathan laughed softly under his breath. And for the first time in a very long while, father and son sat together without arguing. Months passed. Carter's place became the heart of the town. People donated food voluntarily. Local musicians performed on weekends. Teachers held free tutoring sessions there after school. And every night, one free meal waited at the first table near the window, always ready for someone in need. Jonathan's health slowly declined over time, but oddly enough, he seemed happier than ever before. One snowy evening, Emily found him sitting quietly alone after closing time. You okay? She asked gently. Jonathan smiled faintly. I spent most of my life building buildings, he said. Then he looked around the warm restaurant filled with laughter and light. But this, his eyes became emotional. This is the first thing I ever built that feels alive. Emily sat beside him silently. Jonathan reached into his pocket one final time. Emily laughed softly. Another key? Jonathan smiled. No. He handed her a folded piece of paper. Emily opened it carefully. It was a letter written by her father decades earlier. Jonathan had kept it all these years. Her hands trembled as she read the final line aloud. If kindness is passed from one person to another, even ordinary people can change the world. Emily looked up slowly, tears in her eyes. But Jonathan simply smiled peacefully toward the snowy window outside, because at last, after all the money, power, mistakes, and loneliness, he finally understood what her father had known from the very beginning. A single act of kindness can unlock a life forever, just like a small silver key.